I found the ledger while the dirt was still fresh. At my grandfather's funeral, Aunt Amanda tossed a leather-bound archive into a donation box hidden under old magazines, destined for a charity bin. To her, it was just clutter. She never expected anyone to audit. Just paper, Sydney. I waited, then retrieved it. I took it to the State Historical Preservation Office. The curator blanched as he opened the cover. "Lock the doors," he whispered. "Call the state attorney." As the security gate rattled shut, I realized I wasn't just holding a book. I was holding a $4,800,000 family crime. In that moment, would you have trusted your family's dismissal? Or would you have risked everything to find the truth hidden in the ink? The silence in Director Miller's office felt heavy. He did not look at me for at least 3 minutes. Instead, he turned the pages of the ledger with gloved hands, his eyes darting across my grandfather Arthur's precise academic script. I sat perfectly still, my archival training acting as a cold anchor for my breathing. When he finally looked up, his face was a map of professional concern and old regrets. He told me that what I had brought him was something the state had been seeking for 3 decades. He called it a shadow catalog. In the archival world, a shadow catalog is a ghost record. It documents the things that officially should not exist, or the things that have been strategically made to disappear. Miller explained that 30 years ago, when Arthur was still a lead historian at the museum, a series of high-value artifacts vanished. Because the theft of public artifacts has no expiration under these circumstances, and because Amanda continued to file fraudulent tax returns based on these stolen assets as recently as last year, the statute of limitations resets with every new lie. My grandfather was the primary suspect. There was never enough evidence for a trial, but the suspicion was a social death sentence. He was forced into early retirement, his reputation shredded by rumors he could not disprove. Since my father, Arthur's only son, passed away 5 years ago, I became the sole guardian of our branch of the family legacy. Amanda thought that meant the line of resistance had ended. She was wrong. Looking back now, I realize my grandfather did not retreat into silence because he was defeated. He moved into the shadows to become a witness. As Miller cross-referenced the entries in the ledger with a digital database on his screen, he confirmed my suspicion. The items listed in Arthur's secret record matched the exact descriptions of the stolen pieces. But Arthur had not been the thief. He had been the one tracking the movements of every item, noting who had signed the access logs, which shipments were delayed, and which insurance claims were filed with suspicious haste. Miller leaned back, his chair creaking in the sterile room. He told me that while the museum could verify the authenticity of the ledger, the state could not interfere in a private family estate dispute unless criminal charges were officially filed. He advised me to handle the civil side first, to secure the assets before they were liquidated by Aunt Amanda. He looked at me with a sudden, sharp clarity and said that true archives do not just hold papers, they hold the weight of a person's entire reputation. If I'm being honest, a strange sense of clinical calm settled over me. This was no longer just about my grandfather's name. It was about the ledger. It was an account that had been left unbalanced for 30 years, and I was the only one with the professional credentials to close the books. The curator gave me a copy of the official loss report from 1996. As I studied the names of the board members who had signed off on the internal investigation, I saw a familiar signature. It was the man my Aunt Amanda had married 3 months before the theft occurred. Miller turned to the final page of the ledger and tapped a handwritten entry. "Sydney, there is a deed listed here for the coastal cliffside," he said. "The one your aunt told the court was lost in the 2014 fire." I remember the specific scent of old paper. It is a mixture of dry vanilla and ancient cooling earth. While my cousin Madison spent our teenage summers on cedar-planked yachts and at country club galas, I was in the basement of the main estate with Arthur. To the rest of the family, he was a frail man, losing his grip on the present. To me, he was a master historian conducting a masterclass in the language of evidence. He taught me that the most powerful person in the room isn't the one leading the conversation, it is the one who is cataloging it. This was my apprenticeship in silent power. I was what you might call an invisible custodian. I didn't realize it then, but my quiet nature wasn't a personality flaw. It was a professional asset. It allowed me to exist in the background, a silent ledger recording the movements of people who thought they were unobserved. It took me years to understand that archiving isn't just about organizing the past. It is about deciding what is worth remembering and what is far too dangerous to forget. The 2014 fire is a core memory for my Aunt Amanda. She brings it up at every holiday, a performative tragedy she uses to explain away the missing family documentation. She claimed the safe room had been incinerated, taking the original land deeds with it. That loss was the pivot point she used to begin her systematic liquidation of the estate. She told the courts the records were ash, which cleared the path for her to act as the sole authority over the family's historical acreage. I remember that night with clinical precision. I stood on the wet grass as the fire department arrived. Amanda had a cashmere throw over her shoulders, her face illuminated by the orange glow of the library wing. She wasn't crying. She was observing the destruction with the calculated focus of an auditor. In hindsight, I've come to understand that some forms of destruction are simply a crude way of erasing an audit trail. She wasn't losing her heritage. She was clearing her debt. Arthur sat in his leather chair in the unaffected part of the house, his eyes fixed on the smoke. He was 78, and the world had already dismissed him as a disgraced academic. He knew that if he challenged his own daughter, she would have him declared legally incompetent within a week. He couldn't fight her in the light, so he retreated further into the shadows. He handed me a bone folder, a simple tool for smoothing paper, and whispered that a true custodian knows that every fire leaves a residue. To be perfectly frank, I felt the first crack in our family foundation that night. I realized that some forms of dependence stay invisible until you stop cooperating with the narrative. I had spent a decade being the good niece, the one who didn't ask questions. But as I watched the smoke rise, I wasn't just a grieving granddaughter. I was a witness. I remember the weight of the key Amanda kept on a silver chain around her neck. It was the only key to that safe room. The study smelled of fresh cedar and desperation. Aunt Amanda was seated behind Arthur's mahogany desk, a position she had occupied with increasing frequency since the funeral. She looked less like a grieving daughter and more like a CEO preparing for a hostile takeover. She didn't offer me tea or a seat. She simply pushed a thick, cream-colored envelope across the polished wood. "I know things have been difficult for you since your grandfather passed," she began, her voice smoothed into a professional veneer of concern. "I've been looking into your business, and I know freelancers often struggle with cash flow. I'd like to offer you a startup gift, $10,000 to help secure your future." I stared at the envelope. I knew exactly what it was. In my world, we call this a pity check. It is a strategic disbursement used to buy the silence of those who have already been robbed. It is a pattern I see often in my line of work, relatives using these small, visible acts of generosity to mask the massive, invisible thefts they've been conducting for years. They hope the immediate relief of a few $1,000s will act as a cognitive block, preventing you from looking too closely at the millions they've already moved. "There is just a small matter of housekeeping," Amanda continued, sliding a single sheet of paper toward me. "It's a standard waiver. Since the safe room records were destroyed in the 2014 fire, the insurance company needs everyone to sign off on the damaged assets before we can close the estate. It's just a formality, Sydney." I picked up the paper. My archival training allowed me to read the subtext between the lines of legalese. It wasn't a formality, it was a total release of claims. By signing it, I would be legally acknowledging that the land deeds were ash and that I had no interest in the grandfather's historical holdings. Just as I was about to speak, Madison floated into the room. She was dressed for a brunch in the city, her hair perfectly blown out, looking like the ultimate embodiment of unearned vanity. But it was the jewelry that caught the light. Pinned to her lapel was an emerald brooch, 3 deep-set stones surrounded by delicate filigree. My breath caught, but I kept my face clinical. I had seen that brooch 2 hours earlier in the shadow catalog. Accession number 1996-402, officially listed as stolen, lost in the State Museum's 1996 internal report. "Nice brooch, Madison," I said, my voice steady. "Thanks," she replied, touching the stones with a practiced, casual air. "Mom found it in one of Grandpa's junk boxes. She told me it was just a high-quality costume replica he used for his historical lectures. But look at the stones. It's real emerald." Amanda's eyes snapped to mine, checking for a reaction. I gave her nothing. I realized then that their sense of entitlement had become so absolute that they were no longer even trying to hide the evidence. They were wearing the crime to my face. I pushed the check and the waiver back across the desk. I told Amanda I needed my lawyer to review the formality before I could commit my signature. The mask slipped then. Her expression didn't break, it just went cold. She told me I was being difficult, that family loyalty was a two-way street, and that I shouldn't let my paranoia ruin a generous offer. As I walked out of the house, I saw a black SUV with a developer's logo parked in the driveway. They weren't just clearing out a library, they were preparing to liquidate the very ground Arthur had died trying to protect. The laboratory light felt honest. In the cold, sterile glow of my preservation studio, I began auditing the silence of the last 30 years. My archival tools, UV lamps, and spectral imaging software did not have a sense of family loyalty. Reflecting on those sessions, it's clear that Arthur's accounting background wasn't just a former career. It was his ultimate defensive posture. He had designed a ledger that functioned as a trap for those who believed the past could be easily incinerated. I placed the ledger under the high-intensity ultraviolet light. The paper, ancient and thirsty, began to glow with a pale violet radiance. That was when the double-entry system revealed itself. My grandfather had used a specialized, non-reactive ink to map the shadow of the estate. On the surface, the entries were mundane lists of historical dates and discarded furniture. But underneath, the forensic ink shimmered with a different reality. It was a precise, chronological map of every asset Amanda and her husband had moved since 1994. There is a rare surgical clarity in seeing the names of the shell corporations. It felt like reading a list of casualties. Grand Haven Holdings, Coastal Management Partners, all of them linked back to Amanda's husband, Silas. They had not just taken jewelry or paintings, they had systematically dismantled the historical land holdings of the Coastal estate. Arthur had noted the exact dates when the cliffside deeds were lost in the system and replaced by forgeries. It took me years to understand the specific psychological rot required for this kind of theft. In my professional circles, we call it pre-inheritance looting. Amanda did not see herself as a criminal. From her perspective, Arthur's continued existence was simply a delay in her own financial maturation. She viewed his assets not as his property, but as her wages for the burden of his old age. This form of entitlement is a unique type of poison. It allows a person to rob their own father while simultaneously dabbing their eyes at his funeral. They believe they are simply rebalancing an account they feel the universe owes them. I watched as the screen highlighted a sequence of transfers related to the 24-acre coastal parcel. The ledger showed that Silas had sold the development rights to a firm in Boston for $2 million in 1998. But there was a discrepancy. The ledger noted that while the rights were sold, the actual title remained unencumbered in a private trust. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes stinging from the light. I began to tally the invisible entries. Stolen artifacts from the 1996 museum heist, biannual dividends from hidden agricultural leases, the unauthorized sale of the family's timber rights. When I finally reached the bottom of the virtual balance sheet, the number made the room feel cold. The total value of the assets Amanda had strategically bled from the estate reached $4,800,000. At the time, I didn't realize how high the stakes had become. This wasn't a family squabble over old books. It was a $4,800,000 forensic audit of a decades-long fraud. I saved the imaging files to a triple encrypted drive and printed a hard copy for my legal counsel. My grandfather had waited 30 years for someone to read the fine print. I was the only one with the literacy to do it. The name on the deed was not Amanda's. It was mine. It took me hours to grasp the irony of it, sitting there in the blue light of the preservation lab. 10 years ago, long before the 2014 fire, my grandfather had already executed a quiet, legal transfer of the coastal cliffside property. He hadn't just left it to me in a will that could be contested, he had deeded it to me as a gift inter vivos. Amanda had spent a decade playing a dangerous game of administrative chess. She knew about the transfer, but she also knew I was young and occupied with my career in the city. She had been paying the property taxes in my name for 10 years, forging my signature on the tax returns and redirecting the correspondence to a private post office box. She wasn't just managing the estate. She was maintaining a facade of ownership over land she had no legal right to touch. She was waiting for the right moment to present me with that waiver, knowing that if I signed it, I would be unknowingly transferring the property back to her. It was a clinical form of identity theft wrapped in the language of family duty. It is a cold truth to accept, but for some, family isn't a bond. It's just a convenient administrative structure for exploitation. At the time, I didn't realize how deeply my grandfather had planned my defense. He knew that only a professional archive would reveal the trail Amanda was so carefully trying to bury. The developer's closing was scheduled for exactly 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Amanda was expecting a wire transfer of $4,800,000. If I had signed that formality in the study, she would have succeeded. But my grandfather had given me the one thing she could never forge, his trust. I didn't call her. I didn't send an angry text or demand a meeting. Instead, I contacted my legal counsel and the county clerk's office. We filed a lis pendens, a formal notice of pending litigation against the property title. It was sent via a certified legal courier to the title office and the developer's attorneys. In the legal world, a lis pendens is the equivalent of a sudden, deep freeze. It renders the property unsellable and the title toxic. By 9 p.m., the paperwork was notarized and out of my hands. Amanda thought she was reaching the finish line of a 30-year race. I was about to show her that I had been the one holding the ledger all along. The sun was setting over the harbor when I received a notification that the courier had delivered the documents. Tomorrow, the closing table would become a crime scene. The conference room was a stage of silent expectations. It was exactly 10 o'clock in the morning. Aunt Amanda sat at the head of the mahogany table, her posture straight, her pen hovering over the final signature. She looked at the developers with a predatory warmth that I had mistaken for maternal affection for most of my life. When I walked in, flanked by 2 representatives from the State Museum and a process server, the air in the room seemed to thin. The title officer hesitated. He couldn't proceed because the lis pendens I'd filed an hour earlier had flagged the property. I wasn't an intruder. I was the legal complication that stopped the money from moving. I didn't answer her. Instead, I silently slid the blue-jacketed forensic archive report and the court-stamped lis pendens across the table to the title officer. I watched his eyes scan the first page, then the second. The room went absolutely still. In that silence, the lesson was clear. Some forms of power do not need a voice. They only need documentation. There is a profound, almost clinical satisfaction that comes from watching a master manipulator lose their grip on the narrative in real time. The title officer looked up at Amanda, his face as gray as the Maine sky in November. He told her that the seller on record was not the estate, but me. He explained that because of the active litigation notice, the title was now toxic. The buyers, a tech executive, and his wife immediately turned to their lawyer, their faces pale. The deal wasn't just delayed. It was toxic. No one in Maine buys a property with a spectral imaging report attached to its history. The developers didn't hesitate. They were businessmen, and they knew when a $4,800,000 investment had become a liability. They collected their briefcases and walked out without a word, leaving Amanda standing in the debris of a 30-year fraud. It took me years to understand that a reputation built on a facade is only as strong as the paper it's written on. Amanda had spent her life cultivating the image of a pillar of the community, but that image was predicated on the erasure of my grandfather's truth. As the State Museum representatives began discussing the accession numbers of the items listed in the shadow catalog, specifically the emerald brooch Madison had been seen wearing, Amanda's social and financial world began to hemorrhage. She was no longer a grieving heir. She was a person of interest in a multi-million-dollar criminal investigation. The title officer closed his folder with a heavy, final sound. He told Amanda that the wire transfer would not be happening. In fact, based on the evidence of systematic looting and forged property taxes, the state was freezing all accounts associated with her and Silas. Silas was intercepted by federal agents at his office in Portland 2 hours later. The shell companies he built to hide Grandpa's assets became the very walls of his own legal prison. The ledger was finally closed, and for the first time in 3 decades, the numbers were exactly where they were supposed to be. The coastline is a quiet witness. It took 6 months for the dust of the legal injunction to settle into the permanent silence of a closed case. Aunt Amanda did not go to a state penitentiary. The legal system is often more interested in the recovery of assets than the incarceration of family members. However, the price of her freedom was the total liquidation of her own life. To pay the restitution for the 3 decades of systematic looting and to satisfy the civil judgments from the furious developers, she was forced to sell her primary residence in Charleston. She moved into a small rented apartment on the outskirts of a town where she no longer held any social currency. For a woman who lived for the optics of prestige, I suspect that small apartment is its own kind of sell. Madison had to return the emerald brooch, along with every other gift listed in the Shadow catalog. Contrary to what the movies suggest, watching them carry boxes out of the estate was not a cinematic explosion. It was a slow, clinical procedure. It was an accounting. The recovery process took months. Between estate taxes and settling the debts Amanda had manufactured, the final number was smaller than the ledger's total. But in the archives, we don't care about the profit. We care about the balance. I used the $4,800,000 to establish the Arthur Heritage Trust. The estate is not a private residence anymore. It is a permanent archive and a sanctuary for the Maine coastline. We have preserved the 24 acres of cliffside that my grandfather spent his life protecting. My professional team and I spent months recataloging the library, ensuring that every page Arthur touched is protected from the acidity of time. It took me years to understand that silence is not the same thing as absence. My grandfather's silence was a strategic storage of truth. He was a master of the long game, waiting for a custodian who understood the value of a record over the value of a payday. I am the daughter who was worth nothing to the vultures, but I am the granddaughter who was worth everything to the man who knew how to wait. We are often told that family is a bond of blood, an unbreakable contract that demands our loyalty regardless of the cost. But as an archivist, I have learned that blood is just a biological ledger. It provides the data of our origin, but it does not dictate our value. A real family is built on the integrity of the record, how we treat one another when no one is watching, and how we protect the truth when it becomes inconvenient. Amanda viewed her father as a fading manuscript to be discarded once the value was extracted. I viewed him as a primary source, a man whose life deserved a truthful ending. There is a specific kind of peace that comes from no longer needing the approval of people who only saw you as an afterthought. When I cut ties with Amanda and Madison, I wasn't just losing relatives. I was closing a subscription that I had been footing the bill for since I was a child. I realized that some forms of dependence are invisible until you stop cooperating with the narrative of your own unimportance. I am no longer the sensible niece who stays quiet in the corners of grand houses. I am the owner of the record. I visited Arthur's grave last week. The November wind still cuts through the trees, but it doesn't feel angry anymore. I sat there for an hour, the leather-bound ledger resting in my lap. I turned to the very last page, past the forensic ink and the shadow entries, and I made one final entry in my own hand. It was not a number or a date. It was a confirmation of receipt. I wrote, "Archive complete. The legacy is safe." My grandfather taught me that the truth doesn't need to scream to be heard. It only needs to be documented. If you are patient enough to read between the lines of the life you have been given, you will eventually find exactly where you belong. The books are balanced now. The ledger is closed. Sydney has protected her grandfather's legacy through patience and professional integrity. Have you ever experienced a situation where you had to wait years for the truth to finally surface? Or a time when you realized that walking away from a toxic dynamic was your only path to freedom? I would like to hear your perspective on what it means to truly protect a family legacy.